This week on Behind the Headlines, we'll be talking about the biggest challenge facing the city today, transportation. Earlier this year, it became the council's #1 priority, and all surveys of citizens show that this is the one issue that people have particular anxieties about. I'm thrilled to have joined us for this week's episode is Chief Transportation Official Joshua Mello, who's at the heart of solving these problems. Thank you so much for joining us, Josh.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and this week, Josh was in front of the City Council talking about city's bike share program, which is one of the many things that Palo Alto is doing right now to encourage more bicyclists. He's also worked on the bike master plan that the City Council adopted in 2012. So I think this is a good place to start, which is bikes. I'd like to get your assessment of how where the city stands right now in implementing this very ambitious bike master plan, and what could people expect this year or next year as far as getting some of these projects up and running.
So Palo Alto is already one of the most bike-friendly cities in the entire United States. Decade ago or so, the city was pretty far ahead of a lot of its peers. But lately we've kind of rested on our laurels, and I think council recognized that in 2012 that we needed to step up our game and start, aggressively building out our bike network and implementing some of the more modern bikeway facilities that you see being built in other cities throughout the country.
Let's talk about what that means. A modern bikeway facility. What does a modern bikeway facility have?
So, with the formation of NACTO, which is the National Association of City Transportation Officials, back earlier this past decade, and the publication of the NACTO Urban Bikeway Design Guide, which was in 2011, there's been a pretty dramatic shift in the United States towards more European-style bikeways that are separate from traffic, provide more of a family-friendly riding experience for folks that may not be interested in interacting with motor vehicle traffic. So I think we've done really well accommodating some of the more experienced cyclists on our arterials with bike lanes. And, Palo Alto did construct the first bicycle boulevard in the entire United States. So, we've really had in place a bike boulevard network for quite some time, as well as some bike lanes on arterial streets. But I think now we're starting to think about what's the next step? How can we expand that bike boulevard network? How can we better accommodate cyclists on some of the busier roadways, especially the ones that feel comfortable on bike boulevards, but then they get to a busy roadway and they just feel kind of trapped and can't get across some of the barriers that some of these busier roadways present.
Okay, so one of the big objectives is to make sure you're not just accommodating the kind of experienced spandex bicycle riders, but families. Now, what kind of amenities does this mean? What kind of, for example, I know that there's a lot of talk about sharrows and speed bumps. What other kinds of devices that you're planning on kind of installing on city streets to facilitate this transition?
So I think two specific areas of interest would be crossing arterial streets. So even if we have the greatest bike boulevard network in the world, when those bike boulevards get to a major arterial street, if you don't feel comfortable finding a gap in traffic and being able to navigate across what sometimes can be multiple lanes, right. I think that can present a significant barrier. The other thing that less experienced cyclists tend to struggle with is making left turns. So there's a new concept that actually was just rolled out in the United States in Davis, up I-80. It's called a protected intersection, and it's a concept that originated in the Netherlands. And this is where you have kind of a circulatory bikeway around the intersection, and all of the movements are entirely separated from traffic. So you make a left turn by kind of circulating around the intersection. We're actually looking at that concept for El Camino and Embarcadero right now. That's one of the working concepts that we have for that intersection. So I think those are probably the two main focus areas when you're looking at accommodating folks that are not as comfortable riding as some of the vehicular cyclists that are more comfortable in bike lanes and interacting with traffic. And sharrows, I think we're really trying to reserve those to areas where we have no other options and or we need to use them as kind of a wayfinding. We just installed a couple on Palo Alto Avenue between Alma Street and El Camino. There's a a location where the bike lane shifts from the right side of the road over to the left side of the road to continue on Sand Hill Road. And we installed some green sharrows to help kind of position cyclists in the lane as they move over to the left. And also notify drivers that there's going to be cyclists moving across the travel lane.
With all the road markings and signage and things that some of these bicycle boulevards would have, what are some of the things that you might be doing to educate the public? I mean, this is something it seems like a lot of people, especially young people, children, might not really understand what the markings are about.
So, when sharrows were first rolled out in Palo Alto, there was a brochure developed by our Safe Routes to School group. That's posted on the city's Safe Routes to School website. They also integrated education around what sharrows mean and how to operate, in a location with sharrows into the educational component, the curriculum that we have for elementary and middle school students through the Safe Routes to School program. So as we start to move forward with things like protected intersections and bike boxes and two-stage queue boxes, which are called Copenhagen lefts, all of these innovative treatments, we're going to have to educate not only students and adult cyclists, but motorists in town as well. Ideally, though, a lot of these facilities should be intuitive. One of our goals is to design facilities that are legible and easy to understand without, a master's degree in traffic engineering or transportation planning.
And you mentioned one of the big objectives is to kind of create better east-west connections, which is obviously a big problem, not just for bicyclists, but for drivers because of the natural barriers, the Caltrain corridor, El Camino, Alma. So what kind of things can the city possibly do? Because that seems like, potentially very expensive solutions and very significant ones. So what kind of things are you looking at as far as making east-west routes?
So going north to south, the Homer Tunnel was constructed, I think, about 5 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, 8 years ago, somewhere around there. So that was a big connection that, now facilitates, a great deal of travel from downtown to the Park Wilkie Bike Boulevard on the west side of the tracks. It also connects the Caltrain station, to the south side of downtown. So we're working on making some improvements to the Churchill crossing. In the morning, the Churchill crossing sees hundreds of students, within a 15-minute period, riding on the north side of Churchill to Pali. So we've been working with Caltrain to develop a concept plan to actually add a shared use path across the grade crossing on the north side of Churchill. And we, pursued what's called Section 130 funding last year, which is state funding towards grade crossing and railroad grade crossing improvements. We weren't funded for this coming year, but we're hoping we're going to be able to access that funding perhaps next year. And that would make some pretty significant bicycle and pedestrian safety improvements at the Churchill crossing. Going further south, the Meadow crossing, Meadow Drive, we were given pretty specific direction by City Council back in November to pursue a separated bikeway concept along East Meadow Drive. So that would be a Class 4 bikeway, known in California as a separated bikeway as well. And that's what I was mentioning earlier, where there's actual physical separation between traffic and bicyclists. So we're currently working on a concept plan for that. We'll probably be going to the community with a draft concept sometime later this year.
I wanted to ask a sort of broad question. I know a lot of these, there's a lot of different bike boulevard projects happening right now. I think something like more than a dozen.
Yeah.
And I know the city has been holding the community meetings recently. What is the basic kind of reaction you hear from the community? And the reason I ask, I know there's been some concern expressed to us about, for example, the Metaduracrete east-west one that would go behind in that right-of-way owned by the water district. But what has been kind of the broad reaction, and what are some of the concerns you've been hearing from people who...
So we generally get two reactions. The first is that we're moving too fast. The second is that we're not moving fast enough. And that's probably about evenly split. So we're trying to find a balance in, how aggressive do we want to be in these treatments, because, we realize that, building some of these bikeways could have a pretty significant impact on people's daily lives. They affect on-street parking. A lot of the intersection treatments, including roundabouts that are proposed for a handful of the bike boulevards, are unfamiliar to a lot of people. And if you're not comfortable with something, it's sometimes hard to accept that that's the proper treatment or that's the thing that the city should move forward with. So A lot of it has been education around what are these treatments, why are we doing these, what's the purpose of the Bike Boulevard program, and our answer to that is the purpose of the entire bikeway program is to get more people riding bikes. So, if we continue with the status quo, we're probably not going to see, the rapid increase in the number of people commuting by bike that the city, as a policy really wants to see. So, we recognize that there's, with any change, especially in transportation, with any change, there's people that are very skeptical and don't want to see their daily routine, interrupted more than it has to be. So a lot of it's been, we've had to educate folks on what the impacts would be, why we're doing certain treatments. A lot of it has been community driven. In some cases, we've had about 6 different drafts of the concept plans for the Bryant Street upgrade, for example. That's one of the Bike Boulevard projects where we're planning to upgrade the existing Bike Boulevard along Bryant Street. That's actually in its 6th draft right now because we've gone back to the community so many times and tried to find that balance that's so often hard to find.
Right. And on the Metaduracrete project, it seems like that balance has been kind of elusive because it sounds like the community is kind of split. I know a lot of people like it. Some people are skeptical, especially the ones whose houses are there. The city council has been kind of really into it, and I remember last year, staff was a little uncertain about what to do with that one because of issues regarding the water district. And the council says plow along. I'm curious, what are your thoughts about that particular project? And for the people who oppose it, what can you tell them? Are they missing something, or is it just kind of difference of opinion?
So I think that the Metaduracrete Trail was identified in the 2012 Bicycle and Pedestrian Transportation Plan as a shared use path, along the creek channel. I think that was a very high-level look, and it was based on what some other communities in the area have done with the Stevens Creek Trail and, the Guadalupe River Trail in San Jose. As we've started to look more closely at the creek channel and identified some of the challenges, it's looking more like, and this council recognized this back in November, that we're going to have to develop a more of a hybrid solution that, perhaps we have some trail segments in the easier to implement segments of the creek channel, but then we need to look at, an on-street bicycle and pedestrian option that will connect those segments. Because quite frankly, there's some segments of the creek channel where there's very little room to construct even like a 5-foot sidewalk along the creek channel without significantly impacting adjacent properties. And again, we're trying to find that balance. So we're actually going to City Council in June with a draft of the feasibility study, and that feasibility study is going to look very closely at each segment of the creek channel, and we're going to, include lots of information as to what the challenges and opportunities are for each of those segments.
Well, good. Look forward to that discussion very much. And I know one thing that Mayor Pat Burt likes to say a lot is that when you create these kinds of bike projects, you're not just helping the bicyclists, you're also helping the drivers, because it lessens the congestion for everybody. And so I kind of want to transition to the other vehicle, cars. I know that there's been a lot of action right now recently by staff and the city council to try to kind of jumpstart this new organization, the Downtown TMA, Transportation Management Association, which is basically charged with giving people incentives not to drive. I kind of want to get your take on how that's going, because I feel like it's kind of taken a while to set up. What should we expect from the TMA, do you think, in the next year or two? And do you think this nascent organization is up to the challenge, which seems pretty colossal to me?
So the majority of 2015 was spent with a stakeholder group that was convened to help put in place the TMA. And then at the end of 2015, they actually filed for their nonprofit status. And they're currently in the incorporation process. And I think we went to City Council back in February to update them.
It was pretty recent.
Around
right?
February, late February.
I think they actually just got their nonprofit status a little bit before then. So
yeah, so we presented with a couple of the board members and the acting executive director of the TMA, and got some feedback from council. And I think the direction we're moving is this summer the TMA board is going to come back to council with a strategic plan, and then we're going to ask council to approve an agreement with the TMA where the city will provide funding for specific outcomes, specific tasks, and outcomes, and we'll probably elect to include some performance measures so that we can ensure that the funding we're providing is meeting the goals of the TMA. And the premier goal of the TMA is to reduce single occupant vehicle trips by 30% within the downtown area, and those are work trips. We're already at a pretty good alternative mode share right now. 55% of people downtown drive alone to work. That's a pretty low number for a suburban downtown like Palo Alto. So I think it's achievable, and I think once the TMA completes its strategic planning and we are able to execute the agreement with the TMA, I think folks are going to be surprised how quickly we're able to start to move on some of the pilots and the programs and some of the marketing. The biggest component is just helping some of these smaller businesses market alternative transportation to their employees, because the large companies, they have dedicated staff, HR staff that can help people buy transit passes and provide opportunities for information on biking to work and that kind of thing. The smaller companies, they just don't have those resources, and one of the biggest benefits of having a TMA is to provide the economy of scale necessary to do those kind of marketing activities.
And I was struck when the presentation was made to the City Council in February, the reaction from the council was basically, you guys need to ask us for more. I mean, it's kind of unusual to hear the City Council tell an organization, you're not asking us for enough money or things like that. So I know the city kind of plays a dual role in this. You guys are not only kind of the jump-starting agent, but also kind of one of the clients as one of the biggest employers in downtown. So what did you think of the council's direction? Did it give you a pause? Did it make you excited to the fact that the council is willing to devote so much more money than the TMA initially thought?
Yeah, and I think we got the same message when we brought bike share to them this past week, is they don't want us to play around. They want us to get serious and start to move these things forward and, invest some real resources and get the maximum benefit out of these organizations and these programs. And I think we've gotten that message.
No, I realize that there's something that nobody's touched on, and it's I realize it perhaps doesn't directly have to do with transportation division, but one of the things that concerns me the most and why I don't get out of my car is because it's so dangerous. And what I mean is it's behaviors that people have. So it's the behaviors of the drivers and behaviors of some of the bicyclists. I've been many times pulled up to a stop sign, plan to make a right, and somebody just beelines on my right on a bike right through the stop sign. And thank goodness I see them, because if I made my right turn, I would clobber them. So one of the things that a lot of people have said is, the police department's had to cut back on its traffic division, and so I wonder if there's anything built into a transportation plan, or could be, in terms of increasing enforcement and getting people to, stop their cars at intersections or crosswalks and things like that. If if that can be a component that can be built in, or if there's been any thought to that.
So this year, we created a new position called Traffic Engineering Lead. And part of that person's role is to create what's called a comprehensive traffic safety program. And that's going to be a data-driven program. We're going to look at, every roadway segment and every intersection within the city, and, pick, the top high crash locations within the city, and then systematically work our way through the list, implementing signing and striping changes. If there's any kind of traffic signal timing adjustments that can be done to help, address some of the collision history and the collision patterns. Along with that, that'll give the police a prioritized list of areas of concern, and perhaps we'll be able to work with them to strategically target enforcement to some of these higher crash locations.
Yeah, I think some of the neighbors in Middlefield and Everett welcome that.
Yes.
Because I know they had quite a few
Yeah.
incidents recently, and you probably heard from them as well.
And that is actually number 3 on our list of study areas. So we've already created a running list of study areas.
Interesting.
First 2 is Coleridge and Cowper. We're about to roll out a temporary traffic circle at Coleridge and Cowper. We've done some crosswalk markings over spring break. And then we're going to put out a temporary rubber traffic circle, leave it in place for 3 months, get feedback from the public, and then either make it permanent or remove it depending on the feedback we get. And then the second area of concern is the intersection of Embarcadero and High Street There's a high-speed ramp that goes up to Alma Street, and there's a crosswalk that's unsignalized that
Okay.
Palo Alto high school students use to get to the tunnel
Okay, that seems
through
like
to the school.
seems logical
Yeah.
area to take a look at. Great. I wanted to ask, since just going back for a second to the TMA and its plan, I know that one of the things that's kind of been bandied about in the last few years is the proposal to significantly expand the city's shuttle system, which right now is just like a couple of buses, and they're free and not really well known. And there's been talk about a strategic plan and kind of actually going ahead with making this happen. Can you update us on where that stands, and when do you think we can see more shuttles?
Yeah, so we did a survey, late in 2015, and we actually got amazing response. I think it was a couple thousand people
Oh, great.
responded to the survey, and we did some special outreach to the senior community that a lot of them are actually dependent on our shuttle to, navigate the city to go shopping and visit doctors and, run other errands. So I've collected all the preliminary data. We've looked at, activity generators around the city. We put together a base map of all of our transit service within Palo Alto, and we had two community meetings. I think those were in early March, and we collected feedback on kind of some draft concepts for new routes, and also got comments on all of the background data and the existing conditions data that we collected. Right now, we're in a little bit of a holding pattern because I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority is actually doing a complete bottom-up study of their entire bus network. They're calling it the TRIP program, and they've hired a consultant who just restructured the bus network in Houston, Texas. That's
This Walker person?
yeah, Jarrett Walker, and they've seen a lot of success in Houston with the restructuring. But one of the things he does is he looks at whether a transit agency should invest in coverage, which would mean lots of routes with low frequency, or focus more of the resources towards the demand, which would mean higher frequency, more service during the midday, but fewer routes. So the board is actually eventually going to have to consider where they want to, the VTA board, where they want to invest their resources. And under the demand-based option that was presented, Palo Alto would lose almost all of its VTA service except for the 522 and the 22,
just
which
El
run
Camino
along El
ones.
Camino Real.
Yeah.
So that presents a significant challenge for us because, when we, the shuttle system that we operate is based on the assumption that we'll have, concurrent VTA service, the 35 and some of the other routes. So we're kind of in a holding pattern waiting to see what comes out of the VTA discussion.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like if they do go through that, that would just kind of make the first mile, last mile issues even worse if they get away from all the peripheral areas. Okay, and do you know the rough time frame? Does the VTA have a time frame from when they're going to make decisions about whether to modify their bus routes or not?
So they're doing public outreach right now. We've actually asked them to host a meeting in Palo Alto, and I think they've agreed. So we'll probably be giving you more information on that shortly. We thought that they needed to hear from our residents before they consider any cuts to service in Palo Alto. I think it's a 2-year planning process, so I don't think we're going to see any immediate reduction in service. But there is also a discussion about funding transit operations through the sales tax initiative that
Great
is on the
transition.
ballot in November.
That's where I was going to go next with this discussion. Well, I was actually going to ask about Caltrain, but the VTA initiative obviously is a big part of it because I think it was just last week the VTA board discussed which projects they would fund with this tax, and they came up with like a list that they're going to vote on next month, but it seems to be pretty much set now. Everyone seemed to like it, and it includes, I think, something like $700 million for Caltrain, grade separation, and some other funds for like improving. I'm curious. I know that Palo Alto had a pretty strong position, along with other cities in the area, about what kind of projects they want to see funded. How close does Palo Alto's priority list mesh with the VTA's? I know there's some overlap, but are you happy with the list that was presented to the VTA?
So we've had discussions about that list in the Technical Advisory Committee, which I'm the City of Palo Alto's representative to that committee, and that's an advisory committee to the VTA board. I think our number one priority, as defined by council, was to secure funding for grade separations of Caltrain. We're also very interested in bike ped funding. I think we're a little bit concerned about the level of funding that's directed towards bike ped projects. in the draft
So
allocation
it's
plan.
not, it's not enough in your opinion? As far as
Yeah, I think we had asked for a couple $100 million more, you know, when we went to city council and they agreed. The Caltrain grade separation funding is a little more complicated. There's a number of grade crossings, you know, along the Caltrain line within Santa Clara County. I think they need to better define which grade crossings will be eligible for that funding. And then we're very interested in seeing how they prioritize the grade crossings. San Mateo County has a program where they, you know, it's a strictly objective prioritization based on safety issues, you know, the amount of motor vehicle traffic, number of trains, history of collisions. So I think, you know, I think we'd be interested in seeing how the prioritization of the grade crossings will occur.
Yeah, and it seems like, even though it seems to me like it's kind of a big step, because before that there was no allocated funding at all. I mean, 700 million, even though it seems like much more would be needed, because if you're talking about 3 cities along the corridor, we're probably going to talk at least a couple of billion, I imagine, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think seeing any amount of attention paid to the need for grade separations, I think is a good thing.
Yeah, and of course, BART ends up as the big winner, but I think it's getting like, is it 1.5 billion or something like that? It's got a cap of 25% of the entire funding package, and I think the council was kind of hoping for some kind of cap, 15, 20%. I don't know, as city staff and the council, do you think, is Palo Alto pretty satisfied that its message was heard as far as limiting BART funding?
So BART's a tough one because it's a pretty well-defined project and there's a definitive gap of 1.5 billion according to VTA staff. So to fund it at any less than that could potentially mean that it's not constructed unless they were to pursue additional state and federal funding. And there's already a pretty significant amount of state and federal funding that's programmed for that project. So, you know, I think we would prefer that less of the county sales tax funding was directed to BART, but that being said, it is a, you know, there's a defined gap in funding that is required to be filled in order for the project to be constructed.
Yeah, considering the last two measures were pretty much all BART, or at least the last one was, it's still quite a big difference, just having 25% versus 100%. So
Yeah, and we've been very intent on, you know, at the TAC making it clear that any savings from BART should be directed to, you know, back to other projects. We wouldn't want to see scope creep where, you know, there's extra funding so the project becomes bigger
Right.
than it needs to be. I mean, it's a pretty clearly defined project right now.
Yeah, cool. And right, grade separation. So basically, so 700 million's been kind of allocated and may go through in November. The best case scenario, do you see it happening like in the next decade and a half? It seems like such a colossal thing, and yet it's often being talked about as the most urgent project. How should people think about grade separation? Is this kind of like a generation ordeal, or?
So today we released an RFP for rail program management services. And the intent of this is to bring on either a very experienced individual that has managed large projects like a grade separation or a railroad trench, or a firm that has similar experience. The draft capital improvement program that was presented to City Council earlier this week, that includes $1.8 million over the next 2 fiscal years to advance the concept of grade separations at our 4 grade crossing locations within Palo Alto. You know, it may, we've included all 4 for analysis, but it may be that some have, you know, become more of a priority than others in the community. So that's going to get us all the way to environmental clearance and preliminary design. Okay. So 2 years from, you know, by the end of fiscal year 18, we will have preliminary design and we will have environmental clearance if the current schedule, you know, is able to be maintained.
Do you think there's any chance of this getting completed before high-speed rail rolls out, if it does roll out, which I guess would be like the mid-late 20s?
So there's, you know, the high-speed rail authority is in the middle of its environmental analysis for the peninsula segment. And, you know, we would hope that they would look pretty seriously at, you know, not only identifying but contributing some funding towards grade separations based on the impacts that high-speed rail is going to to have along the peninsula. So, potentially that could be another funding source that we could leverage, if we're able to bring the county sales tax funding forward as well.
In terms of safety, recently there was a meeting with the county that had to do with Page Mill Road and 280 and that whole area, and that intersection there. And what they said at the time was, we really don't have the funding to do the big job, the permanent fix, but we can perhaps take $300,000 and do some interim projects that will make it a lot safer. Is there anything that can be done in lieu of grade separation at this time? Some people have talked about the possibility of removing those pockets where a car goes over the tracks and stops at a light, and maybe have everybody have to stop before they get to the tracks. Is there anything like that that can be done in the interim? Is that being considered?
Yes, we're working with Caltrain to identify some interim improvements that can be done. And Caltrain actually has a pot of funding to make those small safety improvements. Some of the improvements that we'd like to see are the installation of medians, which prevent people from passing the gates when the gates come down. The installation of advanced traffic signals, which is what you just mentioned, where you would eliminate the ability for folks to stop on the tracks while they were at a red signal. They would actually stop before the tracks. One of the negatives of that is that right turn on red is not permitted because you can't see, oncoming traffic. But I think, in that case, I think safety needs to really take a front seat, over some of the other issues around transportation.
Considering too that if there's a red light and the gates come down, there's really only one or two cars that can make that right turn on red anyway.
Yeah. So we're definitely advancing kind of interim minor safety improvements, well in advance of when the grade separations are ready to be constructed.
Well, I'm struck in this discussion how many different agencies come into play in solving traffic problems, which I guess I'm going to end this with kind of almost a broad philosophical question. Traffic seems to be like the biggest regional problem, and a lot of what you're doing and what the council is doing also depends on what the VTA is planning with its bus routes, with its funding measure, what Caltrain's doing, what Caltrans is doing. Can a local city solve a problem like traffic, which is so regional in scope? And if so, how? Or are we just kind of burdened to make marginal improvements as best we can and hope for the best?
So I'll keep the theory and the philosophy going and say that I don't think traffic is a problem that can be solved. Traffic is, in its essence, economic activity. And, areas that don't have traffic, like Detroit, are not places a lot of people want to live.
You got me on a semantic technicality. Let's say traffic congestion.
So I think what we want to do is we want to improve mobility, which is the ability of somebody to travel between different destinations. In some cases, it may make the most sense to use an automobile to make that trip. In some cases, you may want to ride a bike or take the bus or take Caltrain. I think in a perfect world, you would have a choice of many different options to travel. You wouldn't be locked into your car to go everywhere and to make that trip every single day. And that's where we have a problem, is there's people that, really have no other viable option, and they are directly dependent on how fast traffic is moving and how well the roads are operating, and they have no other option for mobility. So I think we need to really start talking about mobility and moving people, and not focus solely on the operation of roadways and moving cars. And I think that's where we're moving with the TMA and with the construction of our bike boulevards. That being said, I think we need to make sure all of our roadways are operating as efficiently as possible. And, we're about to start doing some pretty major signal retiming throughout the city with our new traffic signal system. Our comprehensive traffic safety program is going to make sure that, the roads are operating as safely as possible. So I think we don't ignore safety and efficiency, but at the same time, we need to help, improve the mobility options for people.
Well, I could tell from the number of projects we discussed today that you're one of the busiest people at City Hall, and thank you for taking the time to joining us for today's discussion. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. You can view any of our webcasts at www.paloaltoonline.com, and thank you for joining us.